Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pathologists Overseas ASCP Laboratory Quality Management Systems course. This week, our topic is Assessment Audits, presented by Carla Orner from Heart to Heart International. She is not going to do cases today, so this is just a didactic today, but we are open for questions, so please ask your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom to the right. If you have a technical problem, please put that in the chat, and our team will help you answer your technical problems. But if you have a question for Carla, please put that in the Q&A. This is being recorded and it will be available on the landing page where you go to register or where the other recording sessions are within about 24 hours. Please remember to register each week. Hopefully you have all done that, but register each week and answer those questions. As well as when we send you a case, make sure you look at the case in advance and think about it. For Tuesday, when we have Beverly Rogers presenting only cases, as I did on Tuesday, this last Tuesday for AP, she'll be doing only cases around audits. She will be using polling as I did before. So it was really helpful to have understood the cases and the questions so that when the polling comes up, you'll be able to answer those and we'll get a good feel for how the audience is doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carla. Carla, please introduce yourself and begin.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for asking me to work with you on this. So my background is like many of you. I started out as a medical technologist. I worked 7 years of nights, 5 years of evenings, and then day shift. I worked in all departments of the clinical laboratory. I then moved into laboratory management for several years, ran 2 different clinical labs at the same time. And then I was asked to take over anatomic pathology for a system of 10 hospitals and standardize all the processes and bring it all together to be a cohesive unit. After that, I ran 13 labs for the Mayo Clinic and had 10 years experience with Heart to Heart International, which is who I work for now. So Heart to Heart is an international NGO. We work to improve laboratory quality in laboratories around the world. We've done extensive training in Haiti. We've been in Papua New Guinea, also in Cameroon. So I'm very familiar with the WHO standards, the ISO standards, and CAP standards, which are used in the United States. So we'll move on and just start the presentation at this point. This is called Assessment Audits. I would like to clarify that assessment and audits are basically the same thing, and I will use the terms interchangeably. The ISO standards use audits exclusively. And my arrows are not working. Aha, there we go. Okay, so our learning objectives is by the end of this session, you're going to be able to develop a process to prepare your laboratory staff for an external audit. You'll be able to plan and manage an internal audit. We will discuss how to use the results from your audit and you will learn how to advocate for the importance of taking corrective action. So our problem scenario is that you're the quality manager in your laboratory and you want to organize an internal audit. And what steps will you take? So that's what we're going to be working on through this entire presentation. I know you're all familiar with the 12 quality systems essentials. And as you'll note, assessment is one of those 12. I'll tell you, I think it's probably the most important one because it's how we evaluate everything else. That's how we know if we're doing our purchasing and inventory properly, our process control properly. So our focus today is going to be on external audits, on assessments. And we will also touch on EQA, but that really is another entire session. So an assessment or audit is a systematic examination of some part or all of the quality management system. And it checks to see if we're in conformance with requirements. So sometimes we do part, sometimes we do all of it. We want to be sure the laboratory is meeting regulatory, accreditation, and customer requirements. The labs must be familiar with the assessment processes so that you will have some kind of assessment by an external group at some point. So doing your own audit lets you know if you're prepared. In an assessment, somebody's asking all these following questions. Number one, what processes and procedures are being followed in the lab? Exactly what's being done. Do they follow those processes and procedures? Do the current procedures and processes comply with written policies and procedures? In fact, are there written policies and procedures? I've been in a lot of labs that didn't have written policies and procedures. And if that's the situation you're in, I encourage you to contact other laboratories around you and work with them and possibly share their policies and procedures. Do written policies and procedures comply with standards, regulations, and requirements? And you'll want to know what standard your laboratory is aiming at. Are you using College of American Pathologists to be compliant with? Are you using ISO? Are you using the WHO standards? Assessments are performed in a variety of ways in a number of different circumstances. ISO standards are very specific about assessment requirements, and they use the term audit instead of assessment. So the ISO definition for an audit is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which required criteria are fulfilled. So we are looking to see what's being done and how does it comply. But why would I perform an assessment? You do it to learn exactly where you are. You look at your benchmark and you see if you have met that benchmark consistently. You measure the gaps. You monitor the effectiveness of your quality system, and you correct any deficiencies that are identified. And the whole goal with an assessment, particularly an internal assessment, is to work towards continuous improvement. Improvement is not a final goal. It is a process. And every time you think you have everything perfect, you can go back a month later and find things that still need to be improved. So let's talk about the difference between an external and an internal audit. So assessments are conducted by groups or agencies from outside your laboratory, are called external audits. They can include assessments for the purpose of accreditation, certification, or licensure. There's another type of assessment that laboratories can utilize, and that's the internal audit. That's where staff working in one area of the laboratory conducts assessments on another area of the same laboratory. And I can tell you, we have also used an internal audit by using laboratories in the same city to come over and do an audit for us. That sounds like it's external, but they're still reporting back to our laboratory. And we do it as a courtesy to each other because someone coming in from the outside can see things a little bit differently. So it provides information quickly and easily on how the laboratory is performing and whether it's in compliance with its own policy requirements. This path of workflow is extremely important. We all know this is how laboratory testing goes, but most labs and laboratorians focus very much on this red box that says laboratory analysis examination phase. And we are experts at knowing that is happening exactly right. But the part that we need to own is everything from the patient, the test selection, to the sample collection, sample transport. These are all areas where errors can occur and where we need to look at our processes. So, and then the last part is equally as important, reporting creating the report and getting that report to the physician, and actually the result interpretation by the physician and the post-examination phase are just as important. So we need to own the process from the very beginning to the very end. Audits will include the entire process, not just laboratory analysis examination phase. In fact, back on that slide, most errors happen outside of that red box. They happen in the pre-examination or the post-examination phase. So auditing. During the audits, information is gathered about your processes, about your operating procedures, staff, equipment, test methods, everything you do, the environment of your laboratory, the environment of the hospital, how you handle samples, quality control verification, recording and reporting processes. And the most important part I always feel is feeding back those internal audit results, and we're going to talk about that, how you handle that and how you what you do with those results. Gathering the information is important, but what you do with it is even more important. So step 4 there, do something with your audit results. And we are going to expand on that upon that later. Let's talk about external audits, because the ultimate goal of any auditing is to prepare yourself for external auditors. Assessment conducted by groups or agencies outside the labs are called external audits. Some examples of external auditors are described below. So health authorities may assess laboratories to evaluate their quality performance and their compliance with licensing requirements and national regulations. They may also assess as part of the capacity strengthening plan of action or for the public health program needs. Accreditation bodies are another group that perform external audits. Those are organizations that provide accreditation or certification. When a laboratory seeks accreditation, an internal audit will be required to evaluate compliance with standards. So let me be clear about that. The accreditation body will do an external audit, but before they get there, you need to do an internal audit, because that's part of virtually every accrediting body that you have done internal audits, you've gotten your results, and you've done something with those results. An audit might be requested by a major public health program or by agencies that provide funding for programs. Those groups want to ensure that the quality standards are being met. International groups such as the WHO Polio Initiative regularly assess disease-specific laboratories according to their own standards with their own checklists. For example, the WHO Polio Laboratory Accreditation Standards and the WHO Measles Accreditation Standards. So again, if you are a laboratory that does some of the work for the polio and work for measles, and you are ISO accredited, you need to be sure that you meet the ISO standards and the standards presented by the WHO Polio Lab and by the WHO Measles Accreditation Standards.
Hi, Carla.
Yes.
This is Tim. We had a great question, which I thought would apply to everyone. The question says, if our lab doesn't have trained and certified internal audit and a trained and certified internal auditor, can we request such an auditor from another lab? Will it still be considered an internal audit?
So Tim, you can work with me on this. My take on that is, if you have requested somebody, say, like I mentioned here in Kansas City one time, we had a laboratory come audit our laboratory. We considered it an internal audit because we asked them to come and we worked with them on it. What would be your take on that, Tim?
That would be my take too. I didn't want to jump in and answer because I thought, well, they're from outside the lab, but they're not part of a formal, group. So yes. I
think that's a great way to put it. I think external auditors are always very formal, and it's like you're working towards something. Exactly. I'm doing the ISO accreditation with their auditors, so I can be accredited by ISO.
Yes. More questions are coming in, but I'll hold on until you have a next pause, and then I'll ask it.
Okay. Yeah. Ask anytime. I always like to be sure things are clarified up front. So, yeah. Okay. So preparing for an external audit, I would like to pause for just a minute and talk about a way to organize yourself. So with external audits, let's say you're getting ready for an ISO audit. You can actually purchase programs, computer programs that give you these huge spreadsheets that, you know, this is the standard. Did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do that? Those things are pretty expensive. So one thing I would like to recommend is if you work on a limited budget like we do, that you prepare your own. We have used Excel, and we would take each individual accreditation standard or question, put it on one side of the Excel spreadsheet, and then across the Excel spreadsheet is where's the documentation on that? You know, exactly which notebook in which laboratory and what page has that. It helps you stay on top of things. You put in there the last date you reviewed it. You put in what you use to write those protocols and procedures. So it's important to be organized, but don't feel like you are tied to the tools that are out there. You can create your own plan as you're getting ready for an external audit. And when I say you're getting ready for the external, remember that means you've already done the internal. So prepare that document ahead of time and use it for all the audits that you do. It's a way to keep track of everything you're doing and all the regulations that you have to meet. So let's talk for a minute about external auditors. Assessments are conducted. Oh, we talked about that. So you gather all your you plan exactly how you're going to do it. And with some external audits, you only have a vague idea when they're coming. In the United States, we get a 6-month window, and we will be coming sometime in that 6 months. So you've got to be totally ready every day of that 6 months. Other auditors do give you a date and you know when they're coming, but you make a plan, you get organized, you schedule it with your staff. So if you know what date they're coming, you want to have all your critical staff there that know all the protocols and procedures backwards and forwards, where everything is, and can talk to the auditors. And you gather all your information and records. It's not practical if you have a 6-month window to gather all your information and records in one location. So that's again why I recommend a spreadsheet that says exactly where in the laboratory all those things are. So when the auditor shows up, you have it organized. Yeah, just a second. Okay. So when a laboratory goes through an external audit, the lab needs to be fully prepared. So you plan thoroughly, organize, make staff aware, have the right staff there. The audit report is a little bit different. So as an auditor finishes with you, they will give you a verbal report at the end of the day and then send a written report afterwards. And it's important when you do the verbal report that you have as many people in the room as possible from your laboratory. The supervisors should all be there. The directors should be there. It's very helpful if you have the hospital or whoever your laboratory works under, have the hospital administrator there if you can. It's important to know that the laboratory understands the recommendations and that verbal is a chance for you to ask questions. So review all the recommendations, identify the gaps and nonconformities. You learn where those benchmarks or standards were not fully met. Then you plan to correct the nonconformities. And for these, you can go back to the document that you prepared before your internal and external audits. And, you know, where you have down, I have this document here and that document there, you know, those are the documents you have to go back to make your corrections. So plan to correct those nonconformities. This will result in a plan for all the needed corrective actions to be taken for the lab. The corrective action plan should include a timeline as well as who is responsible for each part. So you want to assign responsibility for each individual deficiency, but then you want a person that is overall responsible for the entire report. Finally, you record all your results and actions that are taken. so the lab has a permanent record of the event. Often a written report is useful for preserving all of that information. So how do you organize an internal audit, and why are internal audits good? So most lab technologists are relatively familiar with external audits, but the idea of conducting internal audits might be new to some people. An internal audit allows the lab to look at its own processes. In contrast to external audits, the advantage of internal audits are that the laboratories can perform them as frequently and as they need, and at little or no cost. Internal audits should be part of every laboratory quality system and are a requirement of ISO standards. I can tell you I am old enough to be familiar with when internal audits became popular. It was a new idea, and I have to say people kind of fought with it a little bit. So I think this internal audits are a great way to build teamwork and a great way to help your team work through change management, because doing audits, complying to audits, and doing things exactly the right way is a bit of a change if you haven't done this before. But remember, change management works best when your entire team is involved, and internal audits are an opportunity for you to do that. So when you get ready for an internal audit, it shouldn't be the quality manager sitting down, writing a plan, and executing on every piece of it. It should be the quality manager working with the other supervisors or managers, who also bring in their staff, and everybody owns a piece of it. So if everyone owns a piece of it, it's going to go more smoothly. Number one, they're going to understand their processes better, but more importantly, attitudes are going to be correct. They're going to want to make it better because they're going to be owning it.
So Carla, we have another question about, I've been kind of saving this one for this point in the lecture. It's about an internal audit. And so the premise, I disagree with the premise of the question, but I think it's worth discussing. It says, besides, internal audits are mostly biased. How do we avoid this bias?
Interesting. Yes. I have been in laboratories where internal audits are biased because they want to be right. You hate to admit that you're doing things wrong. And that is a culture in some laboratories, that they don't want to admit there's flaws. I think it works best if you swap what department you're working in. So I work in your analysis, I'm going to do the audit of microbiology. Mm-hmm. And you also just have to work through your team meetings and your monthly meetings and be talking real positively about how this improves the things that you're doing for your patients. I don't think anybody goes into medicine wanting to hurt patients. We all go into medicine wanting to do the very best for our patients. And good laboratory results through the entire process makes patients healthier because they're getting better results. So that is more difficult if you do have a bias towards people not wanting to admit flaws, but it's a culture that you have to work through. There's a lot of team building activities and leadership training that can help. And I am a proponent for when you bring in leadership training, don't just train the leaders, train anyone that's interested, because being a leader doesn't mean I have a position. Being a leader is somebody that can change the attitudes and improve things. So, does that cover it?
Yeah, I think so. That was great.
Okay.
Yeah, keep the questions coming, guys.
Yes, please. This is my favorite part. Okay. Sorry, getting back to my notes. So audits should be conducted regularly, and we've talked about that. So you want to do your internal audit. The great thing about internal audits is you don't have to do it all in one day like you do when an external auditor comes. You can stretch it out over a year's period. You can say, okay, every year in January, we're going to do an audit of your analysis. Every year in February, we're going to do blood bank. you can spread it out and then just look through each department or each process. You know, you want to look at that pre-analytical process. It should be one of those things, but they should be conducted regularly, or, and this is really important, or when there's a problem identified. So when you identify some kind of issue that's going on, a laboratory piece of equipment that is randomly throwing out bad results or is consistently throwing out bad results, then you don't wait and say, well, chemistry is being looked at in September. You take that on, and that's part of an internal audit to figure out what's going on there, get it fixed, and document all of that. And that also goes into your audit documentation. The other place you can pick up on things that need to be audited is if you're finding problems on your proficiency testing, and I talked about unexpected abnormal results for a particular test. And laboratories are required by ISO. They're also required by CAP, and I think it's on the WHO listing that you do have to do internal audits. So, oh yeah, so here it is. So the ISO requirement says that you must have an audit program. You must document those procedures, because when the next external audit comes, they're going to ask to see those documents. The auditors have to be independent of activity. So you can't have the chemistry manager do the audit of the chemistry department. He should be doing hematology or some such thing. Results are documented and reported to management. So they not only get reported to the laboratory management, but if you are part of a hospital system, they should also be reported up to the people that you report to. So if you have a vice president of the hospital that's in charge of the laboratory, he also needs to get those results. And the prompt follow-up action must be documented and part of that whole process. So we just talked about this. We talked about having different departments do internal audits. And this slide actually shows a consultant from another laboratory coming in to do audits. The other system we've used in Kansas City, which is the part of the United States I'm from, is we have professional organizations. In particular, we have the Clinical Laboratory Managers Association that's very active here. And we have used people from our professional organization to come into our laboratories and do audits for us. It's a courtesy to come in and do the audit for us. And then one of us would go to one of their laboratories. And it gives you a larger perspective, because we had about 40 laboratories represented in our CLMA chapter. And so it gives you a chance to see different perspectives and get different ideas on how to improve things. Okay, so internal audit program. You have to start out by assigning responsibility. And the ultimate responsibility lies with the quality manager, reporting up to the manager of the laboratory. That quality manager will be responsible for preparing documents, checklists, and forms. And when I say that quality manager is responsible for it, she might not be doing them all. She could tell the urinalysis department, I need this, 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 and this from you. Make up your own checklist of what needs to be checked. But they are the quality manager is the person that's responsible for scheduling those regular audits. So this is
Carla?
Yes.
Another question. Actually, two questions this time, one from me and one from the audience. So I'll ask the one from the audience first. It says, yes, internal audits should be performed regularly or when there is a problem. How often do we mean by regularly?
Okay, so you want to look at your entire lab, every single section, including pre-analytical and post-analytical, being looked at once a year. But it doesn't have to be all on the same day. Like I said, you can split it up. So regularly means that everything is looked at within a year, But if you start finding issues in your laboratory, you know, you do an audit and there's just a whole lot of things to fix, I would do them more regularly. So regularly at a minimum is once a year, at least according to the definitions I've always heard. But I would encourage you to do it more often if you find that there are some gaps that need to be improved.
Okay, and then this is my question, which is, if I'm working for a lab that doesn't have an international connection, say, where do I find these checklists?
So the WHO standards are available to anyone. I'm trying to remember where I downloaded them from last time. I want to say WHO site. Tim, can you remember exactly where?
No, but maybe I can, we can send that in as part of the follow-up. I will find the link and send it, because I think it'll be helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the WHO standards are the best place to start. So when I told you we've trained in several countries, those were all with laboratories that were unaccredited. And we always start out with WHO because it's basic. It gets you moving towards the steps you need to take to become accredited, say by ISO or somebody else. Or if you just follow the WHO standards, your lab is going to be good. And there's a pride that comes in laboratorians in knowing that we've met these standards. These are international standards. If we're doing this, we know our laboratory is doing good work.
All right, so there's one more question, but I'll hold it. Actually, two more questions, but I'll hold it. So speak for a while and I'll jump in.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for doing this. I like it when the questions come in the right time period.
Yeah.
Okay, so hang on just a minute. I've lost my place. Okay, so let's talk about responsibilities in auditing. So the lab director is ultimately responsible for this. If the lab director chooses a quality manager that isn't doing their job, it's the laboratory director's job to be sure they do. So the lab director, although they're not the person executing on everything, unless you're talking about a small lab, and I've seen small labs with lab directors doing it all. So the lab director determines the internal auditing policy. So whether they're going to do it all in one day, once a year, or they're going to do it periodically, and what documents have to be there. And then he assigns that responsibility to the internal audit program quality manager. And then the internal audit outcomes go back to the laboratory director. And I would actually like to see an arrow that goes even higher up to the person that's directing the ancillary services or the hospital, so that all those results go back. And then the lab director helps support all those corrective action measures. Part of the issues we've seen in some laboratories is you come back with all these measures that need to be improved, and there's a cost to them. And so getting the buy-in from hospital administration that we need to do these things in order to be doing quality work and to meet standards, but it's going to cost money, that can be tricky if there's an extremely tight budget. But if you include them from the very beginning, hey, we're going to do this, and this is an international standard, and this is what we're going to do, and then you come back to them with the results, that there were these gaps, and we need these things to improve, your chances of getting it approved and possibly getting some funding approved for it is better. So I always think the more people you include in an audit, all the way down to the techs that are working the bench and the phlebotomists that are drawing the drawing the blood, all the way up to the hospital director, just to keep them posted and keep them in the loop. Okay, and what's the quality manager's responsibility? So they have to establish and maintain an internal audit system. And that one phrase is huge. It takes, I was going to say hours, I'm going to say weeks, months, to actually build an internal audit system. But it's really important that that quality manager is using the other managers, they're using the techs, they get everybody involved, not just because it's a huge job and he doesn't want to do it all himself, but it's a huge job. There's going to be change in the laboratory. And if you involve everybody, then everyone feels like they're part of the process and they want to see those changes made. I'm going to give you an example of a chemistry lab I was working in. We had gotten complaints from the emergency room that the results were not coming back fast enough. So we did an audit and discovered that the chemistry department was spinning every single tube twice. So they would spin the serum tube, they'd pull the serum off, they'd put it back in, and they'd spin it again. And this is back in the old days when these were huge centrifuges. So from the time you started them until they stopped, they were 15 minutes. So that was 2 spins. We were adding a half an hour time onto those emergency room results. So went through a whole process, decided they could draw smaller tubes, they could use smaller centrifuges, didn't have to spin as long, and then did a process where we tested to see, does it make a difference if we do that second spin, and found out it really did not make a difference. So we got the time for the spinning down to just 10 minutes, which speeded up the emergency room results, and it went really well for about a month. And then suddenly the results were coming back later. And we did have a program out of our computers that we could see what was our turnaround time for the emergency room. And what we found is there was someone that had been out on medical leave that came back after this whole process was put in place. And she just really didn't like the idea that they were only spinning once. So she had reinstituted the second spin that we had taken out. So, setting this up and finding problems and then going back and really tracking them to be sure they haven't backslid is part of it. So I kind of digress, but knowing those kind of things it will help you do this. So get everybody involved, everybody down to the tech, down to the phlebotomist, keep them all involved. So the quality manager is responsible. They're going to coordinate the audit. They're going to develop a schedule. They're going to select trainers and auditors. Then the internal audit happens. The outcomes report goes to staff. And again, look further up where it says select trainers and auditors, get the staff involved because then they will be part of this system. The internal audit outcomes, we have to manage those corrective actions. And once a corrective action is managed, go back and keep checking it. Be sure it really is still managed and you report it out to management. So was that too circular?
So Carla, you just talked about involving everyone in the lab. So someone asked a question which says, to audit a department different than the one in which you are familiar, different than the one you are familiar with, what level of competence and training is required? So
for most med techs, you can audit another department because the questions are so very specific. Now, you may need to ask more questions and become more familiar with things. I would say you would want someone who has at some point done that type of testing. For instance, when I was talking about my experience, I worked night shift. I worked in every single department. So I had knowledge of every single department. So if you can find people like that who may not be permanently assigned to hematology right now, but they've done hematology before, that's better. But if you can't, most med techs or clinical laboratory scientists have enough knowledge to be able to perform the internal audit. And considering an internal audit should be a cooperative experiment, they should be working with one another. I know when external auditors come in, we have a tendency to want to hide things that we think might be a flaw. But if you're working in an internal audit, you'd better not be hiding things. You really better be working with the auditor, trying to find every single problem that might be in there. And again, that works by developing a team and getting people to want to find those things.
That's great. And then one more question, which someone else just answered in the chat, which is great, was how long is recommended between internal and external audit? And someone in the chat, one of the participants also says, most standards agencies specify audit frequency as 1 to 2 times a year. And so based on all that, the overlap will be 6 months to a year between your internal and external audit.
Yes.
And Carla, we have 2 more questions, but I will hold them again. So just keep going and I'll come in.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so to conduct an internal audit, you're developing your plan, you're writing your checklist. And when I say you are, I mean, everybody is. You're working together to get this done. You have an opening meeting. So you pull together the people that are going to be audited and the people that are going to do the auditing. And I would, honest to Pete, pull together everybody in the lab. I would talk to second shift and third shift. I would talk to the phlebotomist. You want people's buy-in. And the only way to make these changes is to make them feel like they're part of the process. So make them part of that opening meeting, even if you got to come in on evening shift and night shift to meet everybody. Collect and analyze all the information. So they've gone from opening meeting to the audit's done, and now you're moving on. So collect and analyze your information, record those results, conduct a closing meeting. Just like the opening meeting, you want that to involve everybody so that everyone can hear, you did great here, you're at 95%, but we got this 5% we got to work on. So that way, when that 5% needs to be fixed, you can assign it out to techs that really understand it better than the quality manager might understand it. Again, it is just getting the whole laboratory on board. It is a whole process that you want everyone involved in. And then you write a report, just like you would for an external audit. Now, I'm a big proponent, and you've heard me say it, that you divide this up. You do this section of the lab in January, the second section in February. So what we used to do is write a report at the end of each month. So if we did urinalysis and blood bank in January, we would write a report. And then at the end of the year, whatever we consider the end of our year, we would take all the 12 audits that we've done, or the 12 months worth of audits, and put it into a final report for the year. Establishing a schedule. So they talk about conducting a regular audit, more frequent audits for problems or areas needing improvement. That's really important. I mentioned that I took over anatomic pathology for 10 hospitals, and the whole goal was to make it standardized. But we also found there were more problems in the outlying hospitals, because we had some hospitals that were 100 miles from our major city. And so we tended to do more audits there until those problems were solved. It wasn't they were doing things, working to do things wrong. They didn't have the resources we did. And so making it all standardized, identifying the problems that were happening here and happening there, and then improving them. We managed to get to a point that everything was standardized and really pretty much on board in 2 years, which for 10 different laboratories was pretty entertaining and pretty time consuming. Over time, audits should look at all the quality system essentials. And when you are looking at, laboratorians, we tend to think, okay, hematology, chemistry, blood bank. But when you're in hematology, chemistry, blood bank, you need to be looking at the information system for each one. And although it's the same system, that their results are being reported out properly. You need to look at their equipment logs. So yes, every single one of the 12 QSEs needs to be examined in each department.
So Carla, a question that goes with that point you just finished. And this is a sort of 2 questions from the same individual, so that we can do them together. It says, internal audits that are performed when problems arise, would such audits require auditing of the entire laboratory or just the areas affected? And so then following on, he says, what are some problems that could arise to prompt an audit?
That is a great question. Both of them are. So it depends on what problem you've identified and where you've gone with it. So you say, if the problem is happening here, do we need to look at it there? And I think it depends on what the problem is. So when we were looking at our emergency room turnaround time, I talked to you about the chemistry department, but there were also issues with the other departments. So when we first got wind of it and we decided to do a improvement project around it, we were working with all the departments and the emergency room to make things better. I told you the story about the spinning in chemistry because that was the problem that came back to bite us. we fixed the problem, and then we weren't monitoring it close enough. Well, we were monitoring it, but we weren't expecting to see it go back to ground zero. So in that case, the first time, emergency room obviously affects all the departments. So we looked at all the departments to see how to get their results out faster. We identified the one in chemistry. We fixed all the others, and they stayed fixed pretty much. Then the one in chemistry came back. And so it really depends. You want to look at the question, what is the problem? If it's a problem that my potassiums are off every Tuesday, and I don't know why they're off every Tuesday, then you probably just need to look at the electrolyte machine. But if it's on Tuesdays, all of our specimens are 10% high in all the departments, then you are probably looking at something more like electrical grid, or a phlebotomist that's bringing all the results, all the tubes down really slow. So again, it depends on where you're identifying the problem. And then you do want to look at all the departments, but you may not be doing a full audit in each department to follow up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, and I forgot the second half of that question.
Let me see. The second half of that question was about what are some problems that could arise to prompt an audit. So I think you've touched on it.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
Great. And basically, I think you need to be talking to your techs. So as you're developing this culture of auditing and this culture of improving, quality improvement all the time, your techs will start identifying things. As the laboratory manager or the quality manager, I'm not going to see those results coming off that instrument every day like the tech that runs that instrument. And as they start thinking quality management, and they start thinking, I need to be looking for abnormalities and variants and figuring out what's going on. Before, they might have very well fixed those problems without really reporting them. But then it becomes more of a formal process. They do exactly the same thing, but it's written up and it's documented, and it becomes part of the culture. Okay. So we talked about setting up checklists, and I gave you a little advice about checklists. The other thing is developing forms for documenting corrective actions and reports. And that's another issue, or another point, where if you have a culture in your laboratory where no one wants to admit there's a problem, you're never going to see corrective actions or reports. So we used to kind of celebrate in this big system of laboratories that I worked in. We celebrated corrective actions. It meant people were watching. And when we got months where there were no corrective actions, because this was a huge system. I mean, we had a total of 2,000 beds across all these hospitals. If there were no corrective actions in a month, we started talking about, okay, what are we looking at? Should we be looking at other things? Let's go back and look at issues that we've had before, corrective actions that we've had before, and really set up monitoring to know, are we having problems that we're just missing? So you want to celebrate corrective actions. People shouldn't look on it as a punitive action. They need to look at it as a way that we are constantly improving what we're doing for our patients. Okay, and give me just a minute to get caught up. Okay, so the next thing is selecting your auditors. And you do want to be careful about who you select for doing the formal auditing. I have talked about having everybody involved, and you do want all the techs involved, but the people you check for auditor, that you select for auditors, should be people that pay attention to detail. They can communicate effectively, both verbally and written. You train them. You want technical and quality management expertise, and you may actually have to do some training in your laboratory on quality management and how to communicate. It can be part of your monthly meetings. It's an opportunity for your techs to get extra training. You know, when you talk to them about, we're going to have a session on communicating effectively, they're not thinking, oh, so I can be a better quality manager. No, they are thinking, why are they teaching me this? But you can talk about the fact that when you communicate effectively, everything runs better in the laboratory. Everything runs better in the hospital. The quality management expertise is something that you probably will need to train on. The younger techs that are coming out of training now, and I would say younger, I mean people that graduated in the last 5 or 10 years in the United States, got that quality management expertise. When I went through training 1.5 million years ago, that was not part of the training. It was just technical training. And then the last piece is you want people that are diplomatic. You don't want somebody that's going to go in and tell them exactly what they're doing wrong, why they're doing it wrong, and they're a bad person because they're doing it wrong. So choose your auditors carefully.
So Carla,
Yes.
there's a question which I guess you just addressed, but it might be good to stress it because it's come up now twice in different flavors. I'll just read it. It says, is it a requirement that internal auditors should be competent? Because the ISO 15189 2012 only mentions that internal auditors should be trained.
That's great. Yes, they should be trained to be competent. But it doesn't define what competent means. So you will be the one, as you're selecting people, you need to be sure that they are competent. And when we're talking about competent, I don't necessarily mean that their bench skills are competent, but they're competent at what it takes to be an auditor, that they know how to evaluate those questions and how to score those questions. And that's something that you will probably have to teach. Did that answer it?
Yeah.
You okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And I just ran across a note in my notes that says any knowledgeable person in the lab can perform internal audits. It's not just the manager or supervisor. Okay. Audits should lead to actions. This is the most important thing. If you are conducting audits, identifying opportunities for improvement and not doing anything, you are putting a whole lot of energy into something that's not really doing any good. The whole point is to take action. And that action is a process of continual improvement in the laboratory. So you take action, you go back and audit it again, and you continue to do auditing until, you know, we used to say in the big system of laboratories that I worked with, when you found something that needed to be improved, you implemented the change, and then you would monitor for the next 6 months to a year, depending on the procedure and how often it's done, and see if things have changed and stayed changed. So it's important to continue to keep that record, to continue to go back and audit it. When I say go back and audit it, if you have good computer systems, a lot of times you can just print a report at the end of the week or the end of the month and see if whatever you're trying to improve was still good. And then you want to keep a record of your opportunities for improvement and the actions that were taken. Preventative and corrective actions should be carried out within an agreed upon time. Normally, the quality manager is responsible for initiating the action. You know, we're talking right now about self-audits, but remember that when an external audit happens, you also have X amount of time to correct things. And it depends on what the corrective action is. So, with a self-audit, you can decide when you want to improve that and how you're going to improve it and how you're going to monitor it. With an external audit, there are some things that you only have a few weeks to correct and get that report back to the auditing body. And then you need to monitor that for the next year to be sure it stays fixed. So corrective and remedial actions, and I just kind of went over those. These actions are the steps that are taken to improve a process or correct a problem. So the quality manager is responsible for that, but they may not be the person that's really doing it. So the quality manager oversees, and of course, this all depends on how big your laboratory is, but it may be the chemistry manager who writes out these steps, teaches his staff, approves it with the quality manager, and he's the one that's monitoring it, reporting back to the quality manager, because all this needs to come back to one person so that everything is kept together. So taking corrective action. Use a problem-solving team. They can investigate root cause analysis. They can develop appropriate corrective action and be sure all the paperwork's done. They will implement the corrective action. They'll examine the effectiveness of the change and record all the actions and findings and continue to monitor. So this is just a big circle. You just keep going around this circle and things get better and better. And there are times you think we're just circling. Are we getting any better? Go back and look at what you did 3 years ago and see how much your laboratory has improved over those years and read the report at the end of the year to see what you have done. Because it's important that you and your team know that you've done a good job. Know that you've made changes that have made a difference to the patients. And you are not going to know that through this real slow process that we're going through. I mean, you'll know it, but it's harder to grasp. The other thing is celebrate. You know, when you have an internal audit and you make all those corrections, meet everybody, bring in some cake, and enjoy the fact that you've done that. Make this something that you all can celebrate and talk about. Oh, here's the intro.
Hi, Carla.
Yeah.
So several things. First of all, there are 3 questions here. Second, we're getting close to the hour, so I wasn't sure how you're doing on the presentation part for your timing. Actually, and also if we can, Dan, if we can keep going. So I just wanted to check all that before I give you the questions.
That's great. We're actually down to probably 5 or 6 more slides, I think. There's not a whole lot more, so we could just go until the end.
Let me just ask one of these 3 questions that's pertinent to what you just said, and then I'll save the other 2. The question is, what is the difference between audit and a root cause analysis?
Oh, I'd love that. Okay, so an audit is identifying a problem. You know, this chemistry instrument is reporting off every 10th potassium as being high. Root cause analysis goes through an incredible amount of detail, and that would be a whole nother presentation on how to do a root cause analysis. It would start out with a question like that about potassiums, let's say, going back to the people that are running the instrument, to how the specimens are carried down to the instrument, who chose this instrument, does it have a good rating? It is it's huge to do a root cause analysis, and that's something I didn't put into this presentation, but is worth looking up and learning how to do a root cause analysis. It's something you do for really major issues that could have caused harm to the patient. That's when you do a root cause analysis, but you don't do it for every small thing that you find in an audit that needs to be improved. Tim, do you have a better explanation of a root cause analysis? It's been probably 15 years since I've done one.
No, that was good. I actually am. When I saw the question, I was thinking I am actually not sure what the difference is, because there can be some overlap.
Oh yeah.
Except root cause analysis tends to ask, I feel like, maybe two more why questions, you know, that are deeper. But no, I thought your answer was great, and I'm not sure I have much to add to that. Okay.
I would encourage all of you to read up on root cause analysis, because when you hit a critical error in the laboratory, it's something that you need to do. Anything that really harmed a patient, or anything that had the potential for harming a patient, but thank God you caught it at the last minute by accident, you want to do a root cause analysis and figure out how you could prevent that from happening another time. We had a horrible example of a patient in ICU that had a 2.6 potassium, but when our tech called it to the ICU, he reported it as 6.2. No, it was the opposite. The patient was at 6.2, so on the verge of dying, and he reported it as 2.6, so they gave him potassium, and it killed the patient. And so we did a root cause analysis and changed the whole process for calling results. We no longer called results. We sent it electronically so that it would be, and people had to answer back. So, but that was a huge, huge investigation. Okay, is there anything else?
No, for now. There are more questions, but I'll save them till the end since we're close.
Okay, yeah, we are. So continuous monitoring is the key to success in a quality system. This is not a one-time and done. This is something that you do constantly. And again, that's why it's so important to involve all of your staff and for them to buy into it. If you're the person that was talking about bias in the laboratory, that you don't want to admit mistakes, you've got a huge row to hoe there, and just you've got to work through it, and you've got to get the right people in place that people are willing to admit error, because we all make them. So this is our circle. We have monitoring and evaluation, which includes customer satisfaction and quality control, proficiency testing and audits. We have quality improvement plans, corrective action plans, and then right back to monitoring and evaluation. And it is just a circle that you keep going. So, and I think everybody, and I say this over and over and over, is you've got to focus on the patient. You don't focus on, I never make mistakes. You focus on, I want things to be the best for the patient. I always tell people, treat this like it's your grandmother's blood. Do it exactly right and know that it's right. And if you need to repeat it, repeat it. And Philip Crosby, who is a great guy, says, it's not what you find, it's what you do about what you find. So in summary, an assessment is important in monitoring the effectiveness of a laboratory quality management system. Both internal and external audits yield useful information. And I will tell you, I think an internal audit yields the most useful information, because you've got an opportunity to fix things and get them ready before the external audit comes. It also gives your staff the opportunity to be involved and keep improving their own work. An outcome of an assessment is finding root causes of problems and taking corrective actions. And when we say root causes of problems, that is not necessarily including a root cause analysis. Again, those are just for extremely bad outcomes or potential outcomes. Our key messages are that all laboratories should establish an internal audit program. They need to be conducted on a regular scheduled basis, and it will provide information for continual improvement. Problems become opportunities for improvement. So, questions?
Thank you so much, Carla. This is good. So there's a lot of there is a lot of engagement here. So let me just go through the questions. This one I'd saved for a while, so it came in a while ago, and this person says, from what this sounds, sorry, I'm having trouble with the question. From what this sounds like, from what you're presenting, it sounds like audits are not costly. How costly are audits really? So that's the question. And Carla, I would say let's really look at what it also costs from a staffing standpoint. So go ahead and answer this question.
I'm glad you said that, because as I was writing the question down, the first thing I wrote down is staff time. It does take a lot of staff time, and it takes more up front as you're getting it all set up and getting people engaged than it does once you have your process set up. So it is costly. An external audit is even more costly though. So it is getting the buy-in of the laboratory director, who should be bought in because it's part of requirements, but also the hospital administration, so that they understand why you're doing these audits. Again, that you're doing it to improve patient results, but it is costly. There's just no question about the time it takes to do these things. So, and it depends on the state of your laboratory, just how costly it is. You know, a laboratory that has already gone through this and they've got their processes down pretty well and they've got all the forms and formats, it's not going to be as costly. But when you're very first getting started, I want to encourage you to talk to all your other friends or laboratory managers. You don't have to have a different corrective action form than that lab across the street. You guys could use the same form. So if you have a professional organization that you're a part of that meets regularly, we used to bring thumb drives and swap forms and swap ideas and talk about, you know, how we would get things done. So don't feel like you have to be isolated in your laboratory doing this. Work with other professionals, and boy, if they've been doing it for a while, use everything they've got.
Okay, so the next question here is, it's a good one. If you come to audit my lab as an external auditor, can you give me a NC? I think that stands for non-compliant, but I'm not sure. Can you give me an NC for just having training records for internal auditors without having competence records? Meaning, could they get in trouble for doing exactly what you said in this lecture, for just having training records but not competence records for internal auditors?
I don't think so. Do I look, when I go to laboratories, do I look for competency documentation on their self auditors? I don't. And I don't know that there is a stated regulation like that, but I am not as familiar with ISO as I am with CAP and WHO. So I would look through the ISO standards and see if you're required to have competency documentation on the auditors. That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer, but I know it for CAP, I know it for WHO, so somebody needs to look up the ISO standards because I don't have those handy.
Okay, if someone knows the answer, if the answer is different for ISO and somebody knows, please put it in the chat or send it as a question. All right, so next question here, Carla.
Okay.
This is a different type of question. It says, thanks, Carla Orna. Psychologically, it looks like there's a great difference between internal, meaning, and then in parentheses, not having to fail or pass, versus external, where you could pass or fail audits. Please recommend to us how we have to be serious, how we have to serious at internal audit with your experience. I think they were trying to say, please recommend to us, basically, what's the seriousness of an internal audit, since they don't have to pass or fail.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I look on a internal audit as a pre-test. So if you fail, you know, and no, you can't fail. No, if you do an internal audit and you come out really lousy on it, nobody's going to close the doors of your laboratory. But if you fail an internal audit, if you have so many errors that you would have failed it as an external, this is your opportunity to get things fixed. So it is a different psychology, but you want the psychology to be excitement about the internal audit, because this is our opportunity to get everything fixed before there's an external audit and there's real consequences. Okay, so it's like this. When I was a kid and my dad traveled, we would all just kind of live in the house and it was a wreck. And then we know he was coming home Friday afternoon at 5, and we all spent the whole afternoon cleaning things up. The internal audit is your opportunity to clean things up before dad gets home.
That's great. So here's a question from someone I know, but I won't say the name. And the question says, do accrediting bodies offer training on how to conduct internal audits in case there's no one competent in the lab to do the audits? Is there training on how to do an internal audit?
So as I recall, when we have done SLPTA training, we have talked about how to train auditors, but it's, golly, I would have to go back and look. I don't know if ISO offers it. I do know that CAP offers training for auditors because they use volunteers as auditors. And so when I trained as a CAP auditor, I took that stuff back to my laboratory and I used those for our self audit. Tim, do you know if ISO offers training for auditors?
No, I don't, but I actually, so someone just posted in the chat, but it didn't go to everyone. It went to just the panelists. So I think I'm going to copy it and forward. It's great. And Carla is referring to what you're saying, that CAP has training on how to audit.
Yes.
So it's not a training, to become an expert in hematology or urinalysis or something like that. It's not subject matter expertise. It's just about how to audit.
Right.
And this panelist was suggesting that perhaps people could use that training in their laboratories before doing an internal audit. The
That's
training
really,
on how to audit. Yeah.
yeah, that is really, really good. It's really learning how to audit was eye-opening. How do you read this standard and say pass or fail? What are you looking for? What are you specifically looking for? And how to write up deficiencies so that the laboratory, not just so that they fix this one problem, but so it changes the way they look at all problems.
Exactly.
Yeah. These are great questions.
So I think for now that we're caught up with the questions, I'm not sure if there any more.
Okay.
For now, we're caught up. So
That's super.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you guys think of questions later, I would love to hear them, and I'd be glad to answer back. Was my email given out for this, Tim?
Not to my knowledge. So we can put it in the chat,
Okay.
or yeah.
Okay.
We can put it in the chat.
Okay.
So another question just came in.
Right.
Can someone audit a single process in a department?
Sure. It would be very focused. It would be very focused, but if you know you have a process that is limping along or broken, that's not a bad thing to do. So you wouldn't want to do it for the whole laboratory. You wouldn't want to do every single process in every single department. That would be painstaking, and back to the cost problem, it would cost you a lot of time. But especially if you know there's a problem going on, it's not a bad idea.
So I can share something that we've done where we audited just a single process, which seemed so small, but ended up being the cause of our problems. We had complaints from the doctors about INRs. So these are clotting times and so forth. And we figured out that it was probably the water bath, but we were not sure because coag tests are very sensitive to temperature. So we did someone just audit just the water bath, which seemed like such a small thing and kind of a waste of time, but it turned out in the end it was good. That was the problem. And we were just leaving the samples in there too high, and the temperature was too high and for too long. And so we changed our it actually yielded it was very positive for us. We fixed the problem that way.
Well, and there are times, now that you mentioned that kind of thing, there are times it has to get down to monitoring that one process. Okay, so what is it that is causing this particular test to be off? So there are times that would be very, very advantageous, but I wouldn't use it for every single audit that you're doing. So it's more like a problem kind of audit.
Mm-hmm. So one more question. So they keep coming. So this one says, are accrediting bodies audited? If yes, by who?
That is a great question, and I do not know the answer. Tim?
Yeah, so in my experience, they're not. Most accrediting bodies have, so they have kind of two functions. One is the rule setting. So they say, you know, these are the rules, or these are the standards, or these are the whatever. And then the second function is the implementation, right? So actually doing the audit and so forth. And usually the body that's setting the rules is not the one implementing the rules. So if I use CAP as an example, because I'm most familiar with that, the rules actually come from the US government, not even really CAP, but the people doing the inspections are individual hospital laboratories that are going around inspecting each other as external inspectors. For I think for ISO, it's a similar type of system. It's not hospital-based, but similar concept. So I think, so yeah. So in short, that's a very long way. It's a very long way of saying no. Accrediting bodies are not audited in that way because they are mostly rule-making bodies, but they're not really implementing. They make the rules, but then other people implement.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will say, you mentioned that CAP rules are set by the US government, but I do know that particularly with CAP, and I assume ISO is the same, that if you have a problem with one of the rules, you can write in and you can influence. And, you know, it usually takes a lot of people agreeing that, you know, that isn't written exactly right, or this rule isn't exactly proper. But there are ways to influence. And I do know when you look at the particular auditors that go out, and again, I'm talking about CAP because that's what I'm most familiar with. We have had some inspectors that were just not great, and we've reported them back to CAP saying, you know, this is the flaw we saw in this auditor, and we would suggest that you either don't use them again or correct their actions. So it's all a process, guys. We think of this as being hard and fast, and these are the rules, and these are the rules we have to stick to. And it is a constant change. You'll notice that with ISO, you know, there used to be this ISO standard, then they updated it on this date, and then they updated part of it on that date. So things keep changing, and you can be part of those processes. There are committees and stuff that they go to. You have to have a lot of experience before you get admitted to them, but it's really interesting to watch how things change.
Okay, Carla, this question comes from, I just like the name, anonymous attendee. How can you have an internal audit in a laboratory that is highly specialized? For example, if the laboratory is just specialized in anatomic pathology.
How can you have it? Oh, so where would you get your internal auditors to work on it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. If it is a huge anatomic pathology laboratory, you might have specialists working in different areas. When I was running the 10 labs that kind of operated as one, just in 10 locations, I had a couple people who did immunohistochemistry. And so I would have someone that wasn't one of the immunohistochemists audit her, or audit those two women. So if it's a big specialized laboratory, you may have people from sub-departments that could help, or call on another laboratory to do it. You know, call your friends.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. So Carla, I don't see any other questions. We are not out of time, but I don't see any other questions. So I feel like we're getting close to the end, unless you have a case to discuss. Do you?
I don't. They set up an entire 2-hour session next week for case studies.
Okay, good.
And they're fascinating. I read through them, so you guys will enjoy them.
Okay, so if we have no more questions, that's the end of this lecture series. Let's just wait. Let's just wait for, say, 15 seconds and just see if any last questions come in. But otherwise, I think we're okay.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much, Carla. This has been really wonderful.
It's been delightful. I really enjoyed it. I just wish I could see everybody.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.